a Wilson Center Fellow whose project work here is entitled Publicity and Religious Violence in Gujarat, will now provide a contextual introduction to the 4 presentations that will follow.
Thank you, Bhumika. I will briefly sort of outline the kind of thinking that went into the framing of the workshop. I don't know the papers that my panelists, co-panelists will actually be presenting, so I won't presume to anticipate what they're saying. At least 2 facts indicate a far-reaching set of changes underway in global affairs. Firstly, the dramatic spread of violence, increasingly committed by non-conventional forces, and the focus on civilians as the chief targets of violence. While these facts provoke a demand for increased security, the character of the political challenge also requires clarification, in addition to a merely defensive response. In the era following the Treaty of Westphalia, states declared the right to monopolize the means of legitimate violence and determined non-state violence to be illegitimate. Today, with a multiplicity of new claimants and stakeholders for power, violence appears to be not only a byproduct of political conflict, but as well a crucial means of advancing arguments for alternative political formations and of challenging the legitimacy of existing systems. Perhaps this has always been the case, but we notice it much more today. The tacit state sanction that appears to be given to certain kinds of non-state or parastate violence in different parts of the world, notably South Asia for our purposes today and the Middle East, indicates that traditional political assumptions about the modern state and its relation to civil society may inhibit understanding these phenomena. We can contextualize our discussion in terms of a couple of historical shifts. First, the period of decolonization following the Second World War, the formal transfer of power from colonial rulers to newly independent nations, at times accompanied by large-scale violence, that set the stage for the Cold War. And then the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the emergence of a new world order whose politics suddenly appears like a throwback to an earlier century, evoked in phrases like clash of civilizations, and with arguments that multicultural tolerance may partly be fomenting the growth of terrorism. To address geopolitical developments on their own terms, it is helpful to connect contemporary events with these 2 phases of rupture that I've just mentioned. To take the first, we can recall that the advent of 20th century decolonization challenged the way in which world history had been conceived for 4 centuries, as centered upon the tiny landmass of Western Europe, rather than, for example, as plural and polycentric. The former view, that world affairs were centered in Western Europe, made it difficult to understand how the majority of the world's population mattered to history at all. With the onset of decolonization, the world began to be seen first through the lens of the nation, and secondly as an extensive set of interconnections, where seemingly remote events could have major effects across countries. These interconnections themselves could not be understood, however, without recourse to the earlier period of colonialism and the kinds of institutions and modes of knowledge that it put in place, with decolonization as a long-term process that sought to undo colonialism's worst effects. We should note here some of the internal contradictions that new nations had to work through. Anti-colonial movements responded to the humiliation of colonialism by conceiving of an alternative community, or more than one community, symbolized very often and manifest in the nation-state. The means of national upliftment, however, derived all too often from institutions and modes of understanding that were shaped by the experience of colonialism. Decolonization thus reproduced a colonial logic at its center, even as it moved past colonialism. The post-World War II period also saw a restructuring of global instruments of governance. The emergence of a set of institutions at this time with global scope, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, international NGOs, took form in response to the post-war awareness of refugees and of an emerging conviction that states were insufficient guarantors of the rights of their citizens. All too often, however, the nation-state became the unit of analysis in all historical discussion, and even in the political treatment of events such as violence, which tend to be framed within mutually isolated questions of state formation. Unwittingly, Cold War concerns of isolating zones of East-West influence and tacitly accepting the superpower conflict as the overarching frame for understanding global affairs has continued to influence scholarship well past the end of the Cold War. With the second of the historical shifts we have noted then, namely the end of the Cold War and the ascendance of the United States to the position of solitary superpower, we enter the contemporary period, where we witness the emergence of a new kind of conflict with states at one end and mainly non-state actors at the other, and the principled refusal of dialogue, at least in the US side, since to grant the enemy a place at the table will already be to legitimate them, whereas the truth, of course, in this view, is that the enemy needs to be eliminated rather than negotiated with. Part of the difficulty here has been that such an unyielding conception of the enemy and the corresponding attempt to exempt the political agency responsible from scrutiny claims an order of sovereign power that itself seems like a throwback to an earlier era. And so, exactly what is being defended in this new war on terror has become the subject of widespread debate. The question is not restricted to the United States, of course, since the war on terror has influenced the domestic politics of several countries, where older religio-political rivalries have often appeared in an updated form. That is to say, we see the enemy through a changing framework of understanding in which we ourselves are implicated, whether as Americans, South Asians, Middle Easterners, whatever. This is, I suggest, a fruitful point of intervention that we can frame for this workshop, bringing into focus issues of religion, language, ethnicity, and as well the ways in which shifts in these categories indicate emerging relationships between majority and minority groups, and the way the political field is itself being imagined and put into operation. We observe, for example, that violence is no longer simply a means to accomplish the ends of the state, as for instance, a policeman arresting a criminal, but a means as well for new claimants to political power to make bids for sovereignty, as it were, and where the spectacle of violence can itself be a means for furthering the ends of violence. And thus, new technologies of communication can themselves act as technologies of violence. So with these opening remarks, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, who is David Ludden.
Please allow me to introduce our first speaker, David Ludden. He is currently visiting professor of political economy and globalization in the history department at New York University. He is also professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, where he has served on the faculty since 1981. His most recent monograph, India and South Asia, A Short History, is a survey of South Asian history, and his current research focuses on the political economy of inequality under globalization. His presentation today is entitled Communal Violence, Ethnic Territory, and Imagined Communities.
Can I go there? I have two visual aids, actually. I want to start by saying it's very nice to be here. I haven't been in the new Wilson Center before. I'd been in the old Wilson Center some years ago, talking about social mobility and caste society in 18th century South India. Do you mind if I can do that? Okay, you don't mind. All right, then I'll just put this up here. Okay, maybe I'll just leave that up there for now. I'll put this on later. So that was a very arcane topic in a very arcane type of space. And so this is a very much more up-to-date presentation in a very much more up-to-date kind of location, and I'm very glad to be here. First thing I want to do is to put out a recommendation that people should read or look at two books, actually, that are connected. One is an edited volume edited by Amrita Basu and Sri Rupa Roy, called Violence and Democracy in India, which is based on a conference that Amrita and Sri Rupa organized last year at UMass Amherst. And another little paperback by Arjuna Padarai, which you might have seen or might have heard about, called Fear of Small Numbers, which actually includes an essay and an argument that he presented at the same conference, but wasn't included in the same volume because it was heading off into this one instead. But these two go together quite nicely. And one of the ways they go together quite nicely is by contrast, because of the fact that, as many of you perhaps know Arjun's work will recognize, he's a very strong proponent of, if not the end of the nation state, the extreme attenuation of the nation state as a relevant unit of political and cultural analysis today in the face of massive global flows and medias and everything moving all over the place. So he's actually what you might call a strong supporter for the claim that global mobility is the framework within which we have to think about cultural and political phenomena just about everywhere, actually, including in India. Amrita and Sri Rupa Roy, Amrita Basu and Sri Rupa Roy represent, shall we say, the other side of the coin, which is recognizing the importance of globalization and global flows and so on. People who emphasize the importance of national territory as a continuing determinant of what goes on inside of it. So here we have, to me, what I think of as being a very important sort of analytical framework within which to think about problems of political imagination, solidarity, conflict, and violence in the world today, is a kind of in a frame that includes, on the one hand, various forms of territoriality, that is to say, coercive, legitimate, legalistic, and to various degrees effective controls of space, bounding of space, controlling of space through territoriality on the one hand, and on the other hand, mobility, the interconnections of space, movement across space, an environment within which space is only defined by the tracks, shall we say, of mobility across the earth and through the air. An unbounded, shall we say, spatiality. Now, globalization is actually talked about typically by people who advocate some version of some combination of these two, with the idea that on the territorial side, the only relevant unit of analysis is the nation state. So the national boundaries, which you can see on the maps and so on, represent really the formal and effective analytical definitions of territoriality. I just want to recommend that we put that position aside for the moment and think about other possible forms of territoriality that have existed in the past and that indeed I would argue continue to exist today in various ways. One, of course, is something that would exist across national domains, something that you might want to think about calling empire or imperial forms of territorialism, which can include a lot of different kinds of national and subnational units, which have uneven control over different units and so on. So if you're beginning to think, for example, of what is the territorial definition of, for example, the World Bank, one would have to think, well, it's not national and it's not global in any unembodied way. It's actually, it operates through national territories. It actually has a kind of an imperial, shall we say, grip on a variety of national territories. Same with American foreign policy and various American projects of control over the planet and so on. Inside countries, there's a whole variety of different forms of territoriality that you can imagine. And the one that two actually that I want to focus on, but one particularly that I want to focus on today, I like to call ethnic territorialism. That is to say, groups of people who define themselves and define their relations to one another in some form of a connection through descent, through common bio, cultural, physical attributes. We call it race, we call it ethnicity. Some people in India, one people might call it jati or caste and so on. But the idea is the same. And in fact, religious identities often constitute fairly large-scale versions of this too. Judaism is one that does it very explicitly. In the Muslim world, it's very, very, very extremely super-duper common to find people who, at the one hand, will accept the the universality of Islam, but at the same time also valorize their particular modality of descent from the Prophet within certain territories of Muslim societies and so on. As I like to say in the history of Islam, ethnicity always trumps religion, which if you're in Iran, you're trying to think about the difference between being a Persian and being, let's say, Turk or something, becomes quite important. So ethnicity and religion and language in Tamil Nadu, anybody who likes to go, anybody who works in South Asia will realize that people have actually ethnicized language. I mean, to be a Bengali doesn't just mean that you speak Bengali. It means that you are born and raised and identify and live as a Bengali, and same with Tamils and so on. And in Sri Lanka, this is of course very important. So ethnicized territoriality is really quite an important form of territorial identity today. With this bit of background information, what I want to do is I want to focus on problems of violence and its relationship to inequality. Economic inequality has become a front burner issue for leaders of our global development regime at the World Bank and United Nations. The 2005 UN report on the world social situation described increasing inequality quite nicely as a predicament because that is to say inequality, results actually increasing inequality, which is increasing around the world today, results precisely from successful production of increasing wealth inside neoliberal globalization, but at the same time slows down progress in poverty reduction. The current pattern of wealth production in the world is actually channeling wealth up the social echelons and making the further and future reduction of poverty more and more difficult. There's been a very dramatic and very widely recognized increase in economic inequality in the last decade and the last several decades, actually. And so that what's happening is that more wealth is being created that could be used for poverty reduction, but less and less of that wealth proportionately is actually being used for poverty reduction. There's a redistributive process going on, and it's not just going on in America, it's going on much more broadly. Now, Seymour Amin and various other people, but Seymour Amin most presciently, I think, identified this tendency of the relative impoverishment in the face of economic growth under globalization as one of the important contradictions of global capitalism, which progressively diminishes over time, as the World Bank actually elaborates in great detail in its 2006 World Development Report, diminishes the capacity of economies and societies to reduce poverty, and also increases the likelihood and the motivations for social and political violence. In this respect, Arjun Padray is no doubt right to say that local outbursts of violence may be rooted in local circumstances, but that the plot of local violence is actually being written at a global scale. Undoubtedly, he's right about that, but I think he's right about it in a different way than he imagines. As authors in the Basu and Roy volume indicate, they're, I think, more on the right track when they emphasize that the linkages between the global trends of inequality and local events that include globally driven, globally mobilized inequality, the links between those events run through national political systems that make the global sensible in local environments. My contribution here today is simply to underline the fact that neither of these books nor most other recent studies of violence under globalization notice at all most of the time or stress adequately in my view. This is simply the very, very simple fact that violence, both legitimate and legitimate, which is unfolding in more and more diverse and troubling ways in the world of globalization, is unfolding inside existing patterns of inequality that are being subjected to various stresses and strains by globalization itself. Here I want to note something that's quite interesting and something that's not necessarily recognized by most people who study South Asia, which is that if you look at this is a wonderful animated income distribution chart from of India, which is available at gapminder.com. The link is on my website if anybody's interested, along with a whole host of other animated data, which shows, I think, very nicely that Indian economic income distribution, when looked at from this view, Indian population, of course, has increased very dramatically over the years. But the income distribution is a pointy version of a normal distribution, as compared, for example, to the Chinese income distribution, which is another more flattened, low-altitude version of a normal distribution. What we find in the Indian case is a situation in which a very largely disproportionate amount of the population is operating in this zone of what we would call lower middle income groups. And actually, when you look at India and you look at the actual incidence of violence in India, you find a very significant concentration of violence among people in these lower and lower middle income groups. We'll find this in Gujarat. We'll find it in different parts of South Asia, in all sorts of different environments. This is a situation within which globalization and liberalization in India is generating a whole variety of local situations in which violence becomes more and more likely and more prominent among people who are competing for wealth and for assets in an environment in which economically the assets are capable of moving people upward, or leaving people behind. They're actually struggling over additional possible additions to their income, which are emerging in the current environment, and which are leaving some people behind and allowing other people to move ahead. So, income inequalities in India are increasing. Inequalities are increasing in an environment of globalization in which struggles in the lower and the middle ranges of the population are particularly prominent in terms of generating possibilities and activities of violence. The macro statistical basis for thinking about this might be nicely summarized, I guess, by some studies that were done on the basis of 2004 National Sample Survey data, which indicated that the new wealth from economic growth since 1991 has gone mostly to wealthier classes who had privileged access to local government and new market opportunities, both in cities and in the countryside, at various levels of wealth, but at each stage or at each level of wealth, the relatively rich benefited more. The top income groups benefited the most, and then lower incomes benefited a little bit less, but more than people below them, and down the ranks the proportional benefits went, so that at each level of the economic wealth stratification, the people who were immediately above you were in a more likely position to be better off. And this has had major effects on economics of electoral mobilization and vote raising in India and so on. But one of the very interesting areas where I think that it has had an important impact is on the patterns of violence. I think people who know about the case of Bihar will recognize that in the case of Bihar, the struggle, the caste war basically that's been going on in Bihar for the better part of 20 years has increasingly involved poorer and poorer groups struggling with one another, mobilizing political parties around them, and engaged in significant amounts of violence at the same time. So that rural violence and electoral politics have been linked together very closely in the case of Bihar. Separating out rural violence from electoral politics, that is to say, legitimate political competition from illegitimate political competition, is extremely difficult in the case of Bihar. In the case of Bangladesh, of course, this is also true. The new government that's put itself into place now is actually trying to do that. But over the last 15 years, or since 1990, the standard pattern has been for rural competition that included violence and electoral competition that was based primarily on raising fundraising for getting votes in the parliament were very, very closely linked to one another. So that losers in one election would then perpetrate violence on the others, and winners in one election would try to kill their opposition, and back and forth it would go. This is a pattern that is very common. It's common in Bangladesh. It's common in parts of Pakistan. It's quite common. Of course, it is the standard pattern in rural Bihar as well. So the gray area between legitimate and illegitimate politics has basically been breached. I mean, the boundary has been breached in these contexts. There's another example that I want to raise that brings brings the case very nicely. It's a local example of a case where economic mobility in the face of globalization has generated a violence, a retributional type of violence. It's the case of the Marvars and the Pallars, or the Devas and the Pallars in villages in southern Tamil Nadu, which really flared up in the 1990s, and flared up specifically in response to these the untouchable caste, the Pallars, Dalits, actually coming back to the villages with money that they earned in the Persian Gulf as migrant workers. These are groups. You got me a time thing going on. What's the time? Like, kill it? Okay, fine. All right, good. These are groups whose mobility to the Persian Gulf allowed them to send their kids to school, allowed them, therefore, to enter a public sphere of schooling and education, which is understood as, in rural India, well, all over India, but certainly in rural India, as a major move of upward mobility. And they invaded the space, the school space of the Devas, and a whole number of riots resulted, which basically had the character of pogroms, trying to keep the exclusion of these people from the schools, from the public spaces, from the places of public mobilization, to keep them out and to keep them down. And in fact, this is a perfect example of two poor groups fighting with one another on the basis of very small differences of inequality between them, with the upper group trying to use their violent means to keep the potentially upward mobility group in its place. This actually raises another set of issues which Jim Boyce and Betsy Hartman referred to with respect to Bangladesh many years ago as the quiet violence of everyday political and economic competition in rural, in their case, Bangladesh. They were talking about, but often is the case in India as well. What globalization has done is added a lot more, shall we say, material to a large number of these conflicts by providing the possibility for economic mobility to people who are variously able to take advantage of it and variously able to confront the obstacles to moving up the economic and social ladder. Just 2 minutes to end with a couple of cases that would probably be relevant here. I'm actually going to eliminate, for the moment, questions of state violence in India, except for to point out that at the higher level, at the higher national level in India, the kind of inequality struggle that I'm talking about typically plays itself out as the state trying to utilize its coercive power to garner resources that it then will use for national development purposes, which translates most immediately into improving the investment opportunities in the investment climate for multinational or for large Indian businesses. There's now protests going on in West Bengal over efforts to take land for industrialization and EPZ spaces there. And there's a whole variety of different struggles that are going on in India over the use of the resources of poor populations to benefit national development, which translates most immediately into benefits for better off populations. The best example, the most well-known example, of course, being the Narmada Dam, whose victims are poor tribal people in the mountains, and whose biggest beneficiaries are the wealthier urban and rural, often small, and to some extent a bit larger capitalists in Gujarat. Lots of other examples, but we will save them for another time. Enjoy life. Take care.
Thank you, David. Our second speaker, Eng Sang Ho, is the Frederick S. Danziger Associate Professor of Anthropology and of Social Studies at Harvard University. He is currently working on the international and transcultural dimensions of Islamic society across the Indian Ocean and its relationships to Western empires. He has published The Graves of Tarim, Genealogy and Mobility Across the Indian Ocean, and his presentation today is entitled A Peace Treaty, the 3/11 Madrid Train Bombings.
Thank you, Bhumika. Thank you for bringing me down here to speak. And thank you all for coming on this, I think, sunny day, if I'm not mistaken, in Washington. For spending your lovely afternoon here. My talk, I guess, surprisingly, comes pretty much in line with what Arvind has talked about earlier. That is to say, the issue of international relations and how international relations since the Westphalian Treaty of 1648 has pretty much been in the hands of states, of national states. With the Treaty of Westphalia, the other actors who had been quite powerful in international relations, such as churches, religious groupings, merchant guilds, roving bands of mercenaries, were pretty much cut out of the picture. In the 20th century, in that period, however, it was restricted to a small area in Western Europe. In the 20th century, along the lines of President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, national determination and all that, after the Second World War, there was an explosion of this community, of this family of nations to include, it was thought, pretty much all peoples of the world, ending up with about almost 200 national states today under the UN system. So this is a system we have today, a sudden explosion of the Westphalian system to cover the whole world after the Second World War. In this system, it is given that states have legal personality, states have standing in the conduct of foreign relations, states can speak to one another, and nobody else can. Civilians cannot. As Arvind also mentioned earlier, in the past, let's say 10 years, even though civilians have not had a word in foreign relations, in the conduct of foreign relations, they have been very involved in international conflicts, especially on the side of being casualties of warfare. So I would like to talk today about the possibility of civilians taking a role in foreign affairs, and more specifically ask the question of whether civilians have a voice in international affairs, and in a situation in which, in the recent past, you have states undertaking wars beyond the boundaries of their sovereign reach, impinging upon other states and impinging upon the civilians of those states. Under these kinds of situations, where sovereignty, where you have war beyond the limits of sovereignty, can you have peace beyond representation? That is to say, civilians who are targets of state-driven warfare, can they have a word in the warfare? And furthermore, can they have a word in the making of peace? A central question which this issue involves is the idea of whether there is possibility of dialogue across boundaries of warfare, leading to a very specific question, how does one find an interlocutor? Is there a possibility of interlocution, and how does one find an interlocutor? Now, let me try to think through these questions with you, not through some theory, not through a series of historical cases, but simply looking at a number of events of very recent history. These events cluster around the bombings in Madrid, the train bombings of March 11, 2004. So this is not so much a talk, but looking at a series of events together, trying to think through these questions I raised. So on the 3rd of March 2004, scores died in Madrid bomb carnage, and I'm taking these images from the internet. This is the BBC News. Powerful explosions tore through 3 Madrid train stations, morning rush hour. Reports of that day sometime. 173 people killed. Turns out almost 200 were killed. So this is the event. This event happened 3 days before the Spanish national elections. Questions then came up. Who did it? Why? Now, to answer these questions, let us step back a bit. Let us step back for a year. In a year before that, 2003, in the international context, what is going on? You have in 2003, a year before Madrid train bombings, you have basically the run-up to the war on Iraq. On February 11th, Osama bin Laden condemns the looming US war on Iraq, and he gives the Iraqis advice on sheltering in the ground from aerial bombs. So bin Laden is there with the movement of events, as it were, and looking over the shoulders of international state actors in international relations. Okay, so just to give you a sense of how present it is, let me play you a sound clip of a speech he gave on February 11th.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رسالة إلى إخواننا المسلمين في العراق. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. أما بعد، فإننا نتابع باهتمام شديد وحرص بالغ استعداد الصليبيين للحرب لاحتلال عاصمة الإسلام سابقا ونهب ثروات المسلمين وتنصيب حكومة عميلة عليكم تتبع أسيادها في واشنطن وتل أبيب كسائر الحكومات العربية الأخرى القائمة العميلة تمهيدا لإنشاء إسرائيل الكبرى فحسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل.
Okay, that's about enough. And just to give you a sense of what he's saying, here's the translation. This is from a book of translations which has been published by Bruce Lawrence very recently. After initial words of praise to God and so on, he says, we are following with intense interest and concern the Crusaders' preparations for war to occupy one of Islam's former capitals, that is to say, Baghdad. So he's making very clear that he is following the course of events very closely. And he is saying that this is a crusading war and so on. He further goes on to say that we, from the point of view of our experience in Afghanistan, have had we have great experience undergoing American bombing, and this is how I survived it. He says that in the Battle of Tora Bora, in that great battle, I will recount a part of it to you, both how cowardly they were and how effective trenches were at wearing the enemy down. So he's saying basically we dug 100 trenches, spread them out across an area no more than 1 square mile, and that saved us. The trenches, the ground which God gave us, absorbed all the American bombs, and this is how he can do it in Iraq also. So he's drawing equivalence between his experience in Afghanistan, the experience of the Afghan people, and he's basically saying that we are looking at these series of events, and more importantly, we are present with you in these events, and that presence is quite striking if you think of it in terms of the oral dimension present in this room today. The spread of this presence, just to give you a sense, on February 12th, you have a report from Al Jazeera coming out of Qatar. The message of bin Laden deepens the divide between Europe and America. And this picture is from Indonesia, outside the Indonesian parliament. This Indonesian guy is selling posters of Osama bin Laden. Give you a sense of the reach of this message. On March 20th, then, the US launches the war on Iraq, as we all know. And as the US goes into war, Spain sends troops to Iraq along with the Americans, despite national opposition, demonstrated national opposition of 90%. or 90% of the population, that is to say, was against the war, according to polls and so on. If you think about it, if 90% of the population is against the war, what is going on in theoretical political theory terms is that in an election, the people give their sovereignty to the government, and when you have a war in which 90% of the people are opposed to the war, that sovereignty of the people is loaned or given to the Americans by the Spanish Prime Minister in the pursuit of war beyond Spanish territory. So this is, in political theory terms, what is going on. Now, what are the costs of that war in terms of civilian casualties? I'm going to show you some horrible pictures which were not shown on American media. These are from Al Jazeera, and you will see pictures of children, women, civilians, a lot of babies, and so on. I don't need to go into detail. But these were pictures which quite strikingly were not shown on American media, were shown on Al Jazeera, and from Al Jazeera spread across the world, especially the Muslim world. So this is the background to the Madrid event. Now, a year later, almost exactly a year later, March 11th, you have the Madrid train bombing. And if you think of the previous set of pictures, and if you compare it with this set of pictures, civilians being injured, there's a certain visual equivalence in these pictures. Although this is BBC, the other one is Al Jazeera. But an interesting thing to note is that many of the Al Jazeera journalists, in fact, are ex-BBC BBC Arabic Service journalists. So there's great equivalence in terms of the visual images of civilian casualties in the war. So that was March 11th. In the next few days, then, what you saw was mass popular demonstrations in Spain, expressions of popular will saying, what is our response to this horrible bombing? You have street demonstrations in Madrid. You had maybe 2 million people, and across the country it is said that 11 million people came out on the streets over the next few days. Overwhelmingly, you had images of here, paz, peace. Here you have the well-known football player, Ronaldinho of Brazil, who was with the Club Madrid football club. No to terrorism, yes to peace. No to terrorism, yes to peace. In a national soccer game between Murcia and, I'm not sure, Madrid maybe, Murcia and Barcelona, the Dutch player is protecting a spectator who has run onto the pitch with the sign painted on his body, no to terrorism, yes to peace, and is protecting him from a policeman who wants to drag him off the pitch. And so on, peace, not war, peace, not war, you get the picture. Now, a few days later, then, you have the Spanish national elections. In this election, the President Jose Aznar of the Popular Party had been widely expected to win. As it turned out on March 15th, when the results came out, they were shock results. Aznar's government, which had the incumbent, which had been slated to win by an overwhelming majority, lost the elections. People in Spain have been talking about the aftermath of the socialist shock victory. Popular Party was swept from power in a surge of emotion after Thursday's bomb attacks. A country on course to reject the socialists has now voted them in. And the BBC then went on to interview a number of Spanish civilians, and let's just look at what they say to the BBC. The people were deceived. The people are very angry. United said these attacks could have been avoided. At first, I had really hoped it had been ETA, the Basque separatists, and not an Islamic group. One of the things which is going on is that immediately after the attacks, the Spanish government had said, this is the Basque group which is responsible. It's the Basque, not the Islamists. And the point being that if it is the Islamists, then it might have some connection to Iraq. So the people feel deceived by the government. Aznar has put people in danger. People never wanted to get involved in this war. So the elections, the bombings, and the wars are now being tied close together in the minds of the Spanish electorate. Now the person, I wouldn't say Zapatero won, more that the government lost. Punishment for getting involved in a war people did not want. Aznar's government didn't listen to the people. To them, people were just stupid citizens, and in a democracy, it can't be like that. Even supporters of Aznar said, I've always voted for Aznar, but it was wrong to send troops to Iraq. I think the attacks helped the other side. Socialists have promised a lot. I don't think it will be better under the socialists. And just the last one, maybe. Another Aznar supporter, I wanted him to win, good in government, but I think the people who voted for him will soon regret it. They shouldn't have gone against Aznar because of these attacks. So there is a consensus that the elections results tie the bombings to Iraq on both sides of the political divide. A few days later, the Islamist connection to the bombing becomes clearer from police investigations and so on. A view emerges among the security personnel that it is indeed Islamist and not the Basque separatists, and this thing has developed since then. Now, a few days then after, so we had train bombings March 11th. 3 days after, we have the elections, and 3 days after the elections, a group comes out calling itself the Abu Hafs al-Masri Brigades, claiming responsibility for the attacks in Madrid. And it says, we gave the Spanish people the choice between war and peace, and they have chosen peace of their own will by electing the party which was against the war, the US coalition. And in view of this, the leadership has chosen to suspend all operations in Spain against civilian targets. So this group is coming up to say, we acknowledge that you Spanish people have spoken. You have spoken against war. We acknowledge that, and we extend to you a peace treaty. Not much time left, right? Just quickly, that interchange then reverberates across the international system. Poland now says, well, we were misled over Iraq. We thought it was WMD. It was not. And so it wasn't really our fault that we went in with the Americans. On the American side, US politicians, such as Dennis Hastert here, third in line, warn against appeasement of terrorists. Hastert says that what does Hastert say? Here's a country who stood against terrorism, had a huge terrorist act, and they choose to change their government and to, in a sense, appease terrorists. So it's very much against this appeasement of terrorists, against a dialogue with terrorists. A month later, what you have is Osama bin Laden coming on the TV screen again, and again this is from Al Jazeera, and he now is extending a peace treaty to Europe, to our neighbors in the near north. And what is interesting is that how do we know who is speaking, whether this really is Osama bin Laden speaking? And what happens is that when you have a voice surprisingly is very hard to imitate. And if you listen to this voice again, you will recognize the voice you heard in a sense a year ago.
تتضمن مبادرة صلح كرد على التفاعلات الإيجابية التي ظهرت عندنا. الحمد لله ثم الحمد لله. الحمد لله الذي أقام السماوات والأرض بالعدل وأذن للمظلوم أن يقتص من ظالمه بالمثل. أما بعد، السلام على من اتبع الهدى. بين يدي الرسالة يذكركم لأن العدل واجب مع من تحب ومن لا تحب، وأن الحق لا يضيره إن قاله الخصم، وإن أعظم قواعد الأمان العدل والكف عن الظلم والعدوان وقد.
You don't have to understand the Arabic, but you can, I think, pretty much recognize that this is the same voice which is speaking. And just to give you a quick translation, he is saying that this is a letter to our neighbors north of the Mediterranean, incorporating a peace proposal in response to positive recent events. I present to them, that is to say, the US and their coalition, this peace proposal, which is essentially a commitment to cease operations against any state that pledges not to attack Muslims or intervene in their affairs. So bin Laden is coming up a month after this exchange in Madrid, and it is not clear whether he is offering a peace treaty or perhaps even simply coming in after the fact. So this is a question I have, I'm not sure. European state officials, the response basically to this peace offer is contempt, and this is from the Independent in UK. Contempt, there can be no such thing, we cannot speak to terrorists, and so on. What happens is 3 days after this bin Laden speech, the new Spanish PM, in fact, Zapatero, indeed orders Iraqi troops home. So 3 days later, Iraqi troops are ordered home from Iraq in as short a time as possible. There isn't much discussion of this in the American newspapers, but Al Jazeera goes on to host a long discussion with various European intellectuals and people in policy foundations, think tanks like the Woodrow Wilson, or the equivalent, Europeans, and there's a whole discussion about whether there is the possibility of a peace treaty between Al-Qaeda and Europe or the US and so on, should the Europeans take up this possibility. So one question I have is, why is a peace treaty ludicrous to Western state officials but not to Islamists? A more fundamental question is, did the Spanish people make a peace treaty with Islamist persons? Was a peace treaty made de facto in this series of exchanges, what you might call bombs or ballots for bombs, as it were? And if ballots and bombs were speaking to each other, did they in fact then share a language for talking to one another? Was this a situation in this series of events, was this a situation in which people-to-people foreign policy did take place in the realm of international relations? And if this sort of exchange did occur, how do we think of the possibility of interlocution? How were people on one side or the other able to find interlocutors on the other side? Through what means? And finally, I won't really talk about this now, but what is the possible relation between democracy and terror in this series of exchanges? Thank you.
Thank you, Ingseng. Our next speaker is Faisal Devji. He's Associate Professor of History at the New School in New York. His recent book is Landscapes of the Jihad, Militancy, Morality, Modernity. And he sits on the editorial board of Public Culture and on the executive board of the American Institute of Indian Studies. His presentation today is titled Media and Martyrdom.
Thank you very much. This paper is about how Islamic militancy, how militant responsibility is claimed and disclaimed in a global arena. And I hope you'll forgive me for its fragmentary nature. On July 7, 2005, as a series of bombs ripped through London's mass transit network, I was going through security at the airport in New Delhi on my way to board a flight for Mumbai. Just before being herded onto the plane, I saw images of the carnage on a television monitor in the departure lounge. Among these were shots of the bus that Mohammad Sadiq Khan had blown up in Tavistock Square directly in front of a pedestrian walkway that led to my flat. Waiting to get more news of the suicide attacks until reaching Mumbai, I was left thinking not only of how close I had come to being one of its victims, but also of how I'd equally become a potential suspect in the process. Of course, I was only one of millions of possible victims and suspects in a global struggle that seemed to explode the idea of responsibility itself by expanding it to the ends of the earth. Hannah Arendt writes about this transformation of political responsibility during the Cold War, in which the globe became a stake in politics for the first time. She suggests that the expansion of such responsibility to a new global arena ended up depriving it of political meaning altogether, and I quote, "Our political concepts, according to which we have to assume responsibility for all public affairs within our reach, regardless of personal guilt, because we are held responsible as citizens for everything that our government does in the name of the country, may lead us into an intolerable situation of global responsibility." Close quote. Intolerable about the globalization of responsibility is not only the conversion of every man into his brother's keeper, but also the disappearance of responsibility as such by reason of its very universality. If as citizens we are responsible for the consequences of our country's actions in the furthest reaches of the globe, or if as polluters we are responsible for the suffering caused by climate change among unknown people in unknown lands, then such responsibility may continue to pose ethical claims upon us, but it has ceased to have political meaning. For having been discovered everywhere, this responsibility is to be found nowhere in particular. It is this problem that Muslim militants grapple with when trying to locate responsibility within the global arena of their operations. For these men, as we know, the globalization of responsibility means that American or British or other citizens anywhere can be found guilty of their country's actions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Moreover, any Muslim sympathetic to or accepting of such American and British actions can also be held accountable for them. Of course, locating culpability among civilians abroad or collaborators at home has long been the stock in trade of guerrilla and resistance movements. But I want to suggest that transposing this search from a state to the globe changes into something quite new. For one thing, a responsibility that can be assigned to every person and place in the world soon becomes politically invisible, and in doing so makes punishment indiscriminate by its very universality. And for another, the militant confronted by this universality is as likely to be concerned with renouncing his part of its responsibility as with finding it in another. As an effort to claim responsibility for others while disclaiming it for oneself, the suicide bombing has special relevance for citizens of countries already seen by militants as posing threats to Islam. I will be discussing the terrorist acts of such men here, all European citizens, and in particular those who bombed London's public transport network on July 7, 2005. By attacking their own compatriots, these men were in fact acting as citizens who, like murderous caricatures of the conscientious objector, refused to assume responsibility for the actions of their fellows, even trying to compel the latter into righteousness by the example of their sacrifice. Given its globalization, however, this responsibility was so dispersed as to be impossible to locate politically, its universality making acts of militant violence possible and impossible at the same time. For if it was not to be indiscriminate, militant violence had to ground responsibility somewhere, since its very ubiquity made this responsibility invisible. The London bombings, I want to suggest, represented such an act of grounding. There is nothing peculiar about this vanishing of responsibility, which indeed presented a very common problem in the immediate aftermath of the London bombings, as one of the government reports on the attacks tells us. Despite almost immediate confirmation of the event as a terrorist attack that had long been foretold, and of a kind London had experienced many times before, rumors started circulating about other elements that might have been responsible for it, including power surges, explosions, and accidents in general. Quite apart from the conspiracy theories that were also in circulation, these kinds of explanation ended up vanishing responsibility altogether by dispersing it into an abstraction. And in fact, it is now routine for accidents around the world to be mistaken for terrorist attacks, and for terrorist attacks to be mistaken for accidents, so that it requires sustained effort by politicians and experts of all kinds to set a standard narrative in place. Beyond its vanishing in the accident, there exists an abundance of conspiracy theories that similarly muddy responsibility by their multiple and unknowable claims. And so the London bombings were followed by numerous reports of mysterious packages, a non-existent fifth bomber, and the equally imaginary mastermind who was said to have escaped the country. Like the suicide bombers themselves, many of these theories seem to be animated by the desire to ground an invisible responsibility somewhere by capturing and punishing some living perpetrators for it. More interesting, however, were the false claims of responsibility made by groups and individuals for reasons of publicity or advertising. Adding confusion to uncertainty, these claims, which are now commonplace in situations of accidental or planned carnage around the world, use the bombings as gigantic billboards for their causes. Indeed, the terrorists themselves served merely as celebrity sponsors for such groups or individuals who in this way forced their attacks into the everyday practices of a media-produced society. As if realizing that their acts of claiming and disclaiming responsibility ran the risk of being hijacked by others, the suicide bombers tried very hard to place their copyright upon the attacks, though of course they could only do so posthumously by way of videotaped testaments. Yet even these were poached, with a video clip of Ayman al-Zawahiri endorsing the attacks appended to one of the tapes. And while a celebrity sponsor like Zawahiri is likely to have been welcomed by the London bombers, it is interesting that their videotape testaments make no mention of such an endorsement, claiming only inspiration from Al-Qaeda. In an extraordinary move, the chief terrorist, Mohammad Sadiq Khan, went so far as to have objects that identified him placed at 3 of the explosion sites, although he was only present at one of them. I suspect that Khan gave these bureaucratic proofs of his identity to his fellow bombers precisely so they might be found by the same bureaucracy that issued them in the wreckage of the attack, as if in a mockery of the equally bureaucratic practice called return to sender. Whether or not he meant to return his British identity back to the state that issued it, Mohammad Sadiq Khan was obviously very keen to claim the bombings, all the bombings, as his own by leaving his prints at 3 of its sites. If anything, this tells us how difficult it was for the terrorists to claim responsibility even for these most spectacular of their acts, since they had, as it were, to go into overkill in order to establish their own innocence alongside the guilt of their victims. Or was it also the innocence of these victims that their deaths sought to share? For despite all their bluster about guilt and innocence, the responsibility that made both these states possible remained fundamentally mysterious to the bombers, who had therefore to ground it by their acts of sacrificial violence. This might account for the otherwise inexplicable uncertainty about terrorist killings to be found among so many militants prior to their attacks. In addition to betraying no signs of militant views before his suicide bombing, Mohammad Sadiq Khan spoke against the attacks of 9/11 at school. 2 of his accomplices, however, Hasib Hussain and Jermaine Lindsay, were known to have expressed extreme views at school, although it is not clear how a phrase like Al-Qaeda No Limits scrawled on a notebook might depart from the anti-establishment culture that is common among adolescents. In any case, we are told that conspiracy theories regarding Al-Qaeda abounded among the bombers, and at least some of them, and I quote from the government report, expressed the view that the 9/11 attacks were a plot by the US. Close quote. These facts are highly significant as they not only demonstrate the lack of ideological uniformity among the terrorists, indeed their lack of ideology as such, but in addition tell us how uncertain the militants were about assigning responsibility for the incidents of war and terror that seem to have engulfed so much of the Muslim world. We should not underestimate the problem posed by this vanishing of responsibility for actual and would-be militants, since their uncertainty about assigning or disclaiming such responsibility in a global arena is not at all uncommon. So in documents released by the US government from the military hearing of a British citizen who had been captured in Afghanistan and detained at Guantanamo Bay, we find the same uncertainty regarding terrorism as well as the conspiracy theories about 9/11 that had been displayed by the London bombers. Like Jermaine Lindsay, a convert of Jamaican ancestry, Feroz Ali Abbasi had been inspired by the teaching of the Kashmiri-based Pakistani militant Masood Azhar and had traveled to Afghanistan in order to join the Taliban or fight against the Indians in Kashmir. While in Afghanistan, he seems to have undergone basic training at Osama bin Laden's Al-Faruq camp, and after the fall of the Taliban in 2002, was turned into American troops by an informer. The documents released from Abbas's hearings at Guantanamo Bay are concerned for the most part with his efforts to claim prisoner of war status, since this would endow him with the formal and legal standing that the US administration's new classification of enemy combatant deprived him of. Remarkable about the written materials he submitted to the camp authorities is Abbasi's almost obsessive concern with the mystery and doubt that appeared to obscure responsibility altogether in the war on terror. Even after taking into account his motive in deceiving these authorities to avoid taking responsibility for terrorism, Abbasi's texts on doubt and mystery are full of interest. In any case, their supposed aim of ingratiating their author with camp authorities is rather self-defeating, given the anti-American fulminations that pervade Abbasi's writing, as well as the purely rhetorical effect of its reasoning for a tribunal that was not concerned with it. The detainee, as he styles himself, uses two forms of reasoning to render responsibility problematic in the war on terror. The first is highly legalistic and has to do with the US government's inability to define what exactly Al-Qaeda is, how Abbasi was meant to have been recruited to it, and what proof it in fact had that Al-Qaeda was responsible for the 9/11 attacks. Abbasi also argues that since Osama bin Laden had sworn allegiance to the Taliban leader Mullah Omar, Al-Qaeda must be regarded as part of the Afghan government, giving its members prisoner of war status, even if the Taliban state had not been recognized by the United States. While this argument might constitute a reasonable defense in a court of law, its irrelevance to Abbasi's tribunal, of which the detainee was repeatedly made aware, deprives it of instrumentality and exposes instead Abbasi's own obsession with the claiming and assigning of responsibility. This becomes clear once he moves on to discuss 9/11 as a conspiracy. This is very common among militants, and I quote from Abbasi's statement. The point is made even more heinous by the subsequent point that Osama bin Laden possessed a fax line with the terrorist American government, that through that fax line he was warned to the similar purport of, the Americans are going to bomb in 1 month's time. Knowledge only a handful could have possessed, all I would surmise within the upper echelons of the American government itself. Not only that, the US military telegraphed its intention to bomb via civilian radio transmission by telling Northern Alliance to ground their planes. Further fuel to add to the plausible suspicion that the US's government was in cahoots with Osama bin Laden. Therefore, George W. Bush's war on terrorism is nothing of the sort. It is but a puppet show pretense to truth and justice. The real war is clear to all with a sense of truth, justice, and fair play. It is a war on the Muslims, a war on Islam, a pathetic attempt at warring against Allah, a crusade. As to the perpetrators of the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, I would suggest those who truly want to know the answer to that dilemma, certainly the Americans do not, to look to those who gained the most from that crime. It certainly cannot be the Muslims who have suffered greatly and can rightly be considered as the ongoing victims of September 11, 2001. I end this response with a quote from Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. And he quotes Conan Doyle. The difficulty is to detach the framework of fact, of absolute undeniable fact, from the embellishments of theorists and reporters. Then, having established ourselves upon the sound basis, it is our duty to see what inferences may be drawn and which are the special points upon which the whole mystery turns. Close quote. Relying upon the methodology of detective fiction, Abbasi's writing is consumed by the effort to establish an absolute undeniable fact, but ends up only with inferences, chief among them being that the victimization of Muslims following the 9/11 attacks suggests the United States as their perpetrator. Far as it is from the sophisticated reasoning of a bin Laden or Zawahiri, this crude attempt to establish political responsibility in a global arena joins the larger stream of militant thinking in its concern with dispelling the mystery of globalization by making the conspiracy theories to which it gives rise come true. The terrorist act, in other words, substitutes itself for the missing facts in this mystery, as if in a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, creating in this practical way the certainty that refuses to yield itself to the eyes of theory. And while such an act has a great deal in common with the tactic of direct action, that once characterized fascist as well as communist attempts to fulfill the logic of history, among militants today it also possesses an existential and indeed epistemological dimension that the former lacked. Although Abbas's texts are much more extensive than those of the London bombers, and very different in style, they too are addressed to an abstract and anonymous audience. And while this makes sense for the video testaments that Khan and Tanvir had recorded to be distributed to the mass media, it appears bizarre in Abbas's letter to his captors, which, as I have already pointed out, barely addresses any issue within their jurisdiction. So in the transcript of Abbas's interview with these authorities, which is appended to his written statement, the detainee is repeatedly asked by the tribunal and advised by the representative assigned him to keep to the subject at hand, but entirely without success. After numerous quotations from the Quran, as well as from the executive orders of the American president, and an attempt to conduct a legal defense of the kind that might appear in a popular film or work of detective fiction, Abbas's hearing was finally adjourned. And indeed, the detainee was not really speaking to his captors at all, but rather to an imaginary global audience, even though he had no idea at the time that his lengthy disquisition would ever leave the closely guarded precincts of Guantanamo Bay. If anything, Abbas's testimony functioned like one of the videotape testaments left behind by suicide bombers, since in it he largely ignored his actual audience and circumstances to speak to some abstract audience in the future. Abbas's narrative is imagined as a media product, and this is important because the media is virtually indispensable in grounding responsibility among militants, though it does so in a way that goes beyond its traditional role of publicity and communication. Like the edifying discourse of old, or some traditional moral discipline, the media functions to build character and turn would-be militants into responsible agents. So Abbasi wrote himself into an Arthur Conan Doyle mystery in which he played a Muslim Sherlock Holmes, referring in his creed to the various incidents he encountered in captivity as if they were detective stories. Thus the, and I quote him, Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, Adventure 24, The Beardless Face Mystery, unquote, in which Abbasi claims that his testicles were mutilated and he was injected with a mysterious substance in order to promote the kind of beard growth that would make him appear the image of a fanatical Muslim. Similarly, we are told that the London bombers repeatedly watched videotapes of Muslims fighting and being killed in places like Bosnia or Chechnya in order to fire their imaginations and steel their resolve. As a form of self-incitement, of course, these videotapes operated like pornography, though even here the practice of edification should not be dismissed. In any case, such media did not work merely to communicate or publicize information, this latter being turned by the future terrorists to rather different existential and epistemological ends. Closer to the tradition of character building is the way in which militants model their behavior upon that of men like Osama bin Laden or Ayman al-Zawahiri, each with a very different style of speech and presentation. Some of the London bombers, however, mixed these individual styles into a generic model of militancy, as displayed in the videotape testaments that were to be aired posthumously on Al Jazeera. Thus, Khan and Shahzad Tanveer both imitated bin Laden's locutions as they appear in English translation, while adopting Zawahiri's more animated body language, which includes wagging a finger at the camera to emphasize his rhetorical points. Also important as a model for Khan's testament was that of a British Muslim with the nom de guerre of Suraka al-Andalusi, or Suraka the Spaniard, who had been killed in 2002 during the American bombardment of Tora Bora. Significant about these internal media references are two facts. Not only has character building shifted its focus from living or bookish models to videotaped ones, but this visual medium functions to restrict communication to itself. Instead of serving as the media by which living persons might communicate, television footage and video clips increasingly communicate only with one another in militant testaments, which after all make no distinction between the living and the dead. What kind of communication do visual media make possible when one or more of the speakers are dead? Neither messages transmitted by their technology around the globe, nor publicity obtained by the same means to flatter an ego or further a cause, but rather something as old-fashioned as immortality. And what this immortality might lack by way of its historical survival as a living memory, it more than makes up for in the sheer extent of its subject's global notoriety. Like literary works in the past, or even Firoz Abbas's narrative of mystery in the present, media today offers the suicide bomber a posthumous life, in this way constituting a medium in the occult sense, one that allows him to speak after dying. Stopping at a shop on his way to blow himself up, Tanveer is described as looking directly into its surveillance camera as if contemplating its future broadcast to the world and therefore his own death and immortality. He might as well have winked at the camera, sharing with the millions who would soon see its footage the secret that he could control both his future and theirs. Of course, immortality is not a feature unique to the suicide bomber's videotape testament, being a quality commonly invoked in reference to the classic films or television reruns that also depart from a simple-minded theory of communications technology. What is original about the militant's use of this medium, however, is that he claims responsibility through it. But such responsibility differs from the sort claimed by terrorists in the past, for by preceding rather than following the terrorist act, the suicide bomber's videotape testament works to create and foreshadow his responsibility instead of merely illustrating it. I would go so far as to suggest that it allows the militant to become responsible in a posthumous way by broadcasting his impending death to ground this responsibility while simultaneously withdrawing from its ubiquity in a dramatic act of sacrifice. Indeed, the suicide bomber can only ground responsibility in this dual sense by dying for it. But this is the same thing as saying that the only good Muslim is a dead Muslim. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. Finally, Arvind Rajagopal will be presenting his presentation. A little bit about Arvind Rajagopal. He's associate professor in the departments of media, culture and communication, social and cultural analysis, and sociology at New York University. His major publications include Politics After Television, Religious Nationalism, and the Reshaping of the Public in India, which won the Ananda Kentish Kumaraswamy Prize from the Association of Asian Studies in 2003. He has also edited Technologies of Perception and America and Its Others, Cosmopolitan Terror as Globalization. And his presentation today is entitled Publicity and Religious Violence in Gujarat.
Thank you, Bhumika. With historians and anthropologists dwelling so largely on questions of media, I find myself drawn in the same direction. And in my paper, I will try to offer some ideas about what the importance of the media has been in the case of Hindu nationalism in India, specifically the events in Gujarat to the year 2002. But a word or two prior to that, the question of how post-independence politics has to be understood in India is not an easy one. The ways in which the history and politics of the post-independence period following 1947 in India has been identified with the fortunes of one party, the Congress Party, which was responsible for winning the anti-colonial struggle against the British and bringing the country to independence and so forth. The extent to which all politics from left wing to right wing tended to be subsumed by the representation of the Congress Party, the extent to which it was omnivorous of every kind of political expression, or sought to be, presented a problem not simply for political dissent and how it could be articulated, but as well for thinking about what form of opposition there might be that could legitimately express, enunciate, define itself with such a all-encompassing hegemonic force. The crowning irony to this problem came when the long anticipated threat of Hindu nationalism, of atavistic religious identity and so forth, championed in some form or other by the Hindu nationalist BJP. The crowning irony came when this party actually came to occupy power at the center, 1998. Until this time, the party had been tended to be treated as a potential threat to law and order, even while the supporters for its championing of Hindu identity grew and grew. Once it occupied power, however, we witnessed the same kinds of arguments that had been earlier made for the Congress Party in its various forms, that there was no alternative to it, that it needed to stay in power in order to ensure that economic growth would be maintained, various ways of actually making it difficult to understand how an opposition could emerge and so forth. And of course, as many of us know, the BJP, when it came had to face national elections in 2004, was eventually defeated at that time, and the Congress, in some form, has returned to power. Now, what is interesting here is that while we're accustomed to thinking about a left wing and a right wing in parliamentary politics, in the case of post-independence Indian politics, the Congress was both left wing and right wing in a sense. It was everything. There was the Congress, and there were those parties that usually ineffectually tried to oppose the Congress. Thereafter, the way in which the political opposition was understood changed to secular versus communal, or secular versus Hindu majoritarian. Now, it's important to note this understanding was not shared across the political spectrum. This was a Congress-derived understanding. The Congress was secular, its opponents were not. Their opponents understood it exactly in the opposite way. The Hindu Nationalist Party would say they were the real secularists, whereas the Congress was pseudo-secular. What we have arrived at in India by some strange twists and turns of fate really appears to be the case, where we have eventually arrived at a political spectrum of one party demonstrably different from another party, one claiming to be secular, the other claiming to be secular in a different way. In other words, we have no language for describing this political spectrum that is acceptable to different ends of the political spectrum, and yet it is, in some sense, a political spectrum. Here I suggest we have the problem of how political violence can be enfolded within a democratic process and reproduced, and I suggest India presents such an example. Now, the events that I'm talking about have their most immediate beginning in February of 2002 in Gujarat, when a train, the Sabarmati Express, returning from Ayodhya, had stopped at the Godhra station in Gujarat, and an altercation ensued between inhabitants, occupants of the train, and those who were on the platform selling tea. The exact sequence of events is disputed, but we know that one compartment of the train caught fire, killing 58 people that were within it, many of them Hindu militants, perhaps all. The chief minister of Gujarat, who belonged to the BJP, Narendra Modi, called a high-level meeting, instructed his officers not to interfere in the expression of popular anger. And in the days and weeks and months that followed, there was very intense violence, very often aided by police, against Muslims almost entirely, in which at least 2,000 Muslims were killed, hundreds burned to death, hundreds of women raped and killed, and so forth. Following this highly publicized series of violent acts from February, March onwards in 2002, the BJP won the state elections in that area, Gujarat, in elections that were held in December, and the victory that was recorded was strongest in those areas where the violence against Muslims was greatest. Now here we then have an interesting sequence of events which I'm trying to make sense of. Who could digest the poison of the Gujarat elections without inviting instant death? According to the Indian Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee at the time, the BJP alone, like Lord Shiva, could partake of the venom, digest it, and remain alive. In this extraordinary image, Vajpayee may have been referring to the party's electoral invulnerability, such that even the gruesome violence on and after February 27 could not affect the BJP's chances of victory, despite all the charges of political connivance. Far from expressing regret at the death and destruction, the Prime Minister appeared to be boasting of the aura it created around the party that had made it more godlike and fearsome. Was it the case with Gujarat? And as I say, in the elections that followed, the appeared actually to redound in the BJP's favor, with BJP winning 52 of the 65 seats in north and central Gujarat, where the violence was concentrated. The way in which this was explained by the BJP was that the voters demanded some act of revenge for the violence believed to be perpetrated by Muslims in Godhra, and so this was, to some extent, justifiable revenge. Now, if we accept this kind, and such an explanation was not restricted to the BJP, many liberal and secular critics were not clear about how they could avoid such an explanation. It indeed seemed to be true. But what I'd like to ask is, if we are able to attribute the causes of collective action to information presented over the newspapers and television about contemporary events, which is then processed, the causal relations adduced, and collective action then follows thereafter, we are attributing a kind of rationality, a kind of relationship to information, kind of realistic mode of perception, which is contradicted by various other facts that we know. For instance, here is Vajpayee claiming the power of Lord Shiva for the party, claiming that it has this godlike ability to drink and dissolve poison, which makes it invulnerable. So we have, mythical and realistic understandings of the world apparently side by side, no way of making sense of their juxtaposition. The mystery for me deepened when I started to talk to various people that I knew, both in New York, in India, on the telephone, and of course when I was able to go there a little later in the year. For instance, chatting with an undergraduate of Gujarati origin who was active in organizing South Asians for a South Asia Studies program on campus, I asked what people had been saying about recent events in Gujarat. She told me that nearly half of the students of South Asian origin at NYU were Gujarati, so I assumed there must have been some mention of this. She looked blank. What events? She asked. There were many people killed, I said, not wanting to say too much. There was an earthquake in Gujarat 2 years ago, she said, trying to guess what I might have in mind. We raised some money for it, she added. This conversation occurred in October, some months after Godhra, but in the midst of national debates on the election. But the massacres evoked no recognition. It was tempting to dismiss this as the response of an uninformed youth to a vague question. I was reminded of it a few days later when, speaking to an elderly relative in India, she remarked, "See what they've done. They've come into a temple and killed people." She was referring to the attack at Akshardham in Gandhinagar, some miles away from Ahmedabad in Gujarat, the capital of Gujarat actually, where militants came in and killed several pilgrims. And so my response was, this is because of all the killings that just happened. She sounded perplexed. What killings? All the killings that happened earlier this year, I said, when many people died. Again, not wanting to say too much. She remained confused. There was an earthquake some time ago, she said, implying that must be what I was referring to. I don't think her failure to remember was deliberate. Violence committed by so-called Hindus did not seem to register as violence. Neither of the persons I spoke to seemed to recognize Hindu aggression. Both referred instead to the earthquake of 2000, invoking a metaphoric Richter scale of destruction and tectonic shift. And there are other accounts that report very similar kinds of responses from human rights lawyers and so forth. The accounts that I report here are neither specifically religious nor political. They cannot be ascribed to ignorance in any simple sense either. News about Gujarat was abundant, but absorption of their import was contingent on prevailing frames of understanding. The little available news analysis of news coverage about Gujarat does not point to any obvious pro-BJP tilt either. Thus, for instance, the Editors Guild report concluded after a survey of news coverage on Gujarat that, quote, barring some notable offenders, especially Sandesh and Gujarat Samachar, both of them Gujarati language papers, and certain local cable channels, the news media played an exemplary role. One author of the report has gone further to say that the news media were critical in bringing the violence to an end, and that it would have gone on for much longer if not for press and TV coverage. Clearly, we still have much to learn about the structures of popular perception and cannot assume the self-evident power of a realist sensibility. My next section is titled Secularism in India and an Epistemological Break, and I have to skate over large passages to accommodate myself in the time, but to try and summarize, arguments about secularism in India have preeminently treated it as a domain of prescription, of determining how best to create a nation where religious influence was minimized. Secularism, this meant, was largely an expert matter, adjudicated by professionals on a case-by-case basis, with the treatment differing according to whether the issue was political elections, religious groups, government quotas, or jobs, educational institutions, and so forth. But the debate on secularism, I suggest, experienced an epistemological break when it shifted from being an expert to a political matter. That is to say, the mechanisms by which the object of knowledge called secularism was produced changed. In the 1980s, the question of secularism came to be seen as an all-or-nothing issue. That is, it became a question of national identity. That is not to say that national identity was absent or unimportant before. In secularism, what the surfacing of national identity as a problem indicated rather was that its earlier form came to be questioned. To the extent that a secular nationalism was earlier preponderant, we can say that the identity corresponding to it came under attack. More precisely, there had not been a concerted attempt to challenge it before. When competing ways of seeing the world gained valence, secular nationalism was revealed to be under-elaborated as a theory and underrepresented as an identity. It is possible that the kinds of innocence or ignorance that I cited earlier were prevalent before. However, in the prevailing political context, they clearly took on a different significance. Secularism, for its part, had sought to establish and sanction its own worldview, of course, one that came into crisis. One can note several points here. We can locate one moment with the perhaps the first moment in post-independence India with the national emergency of 1975-77, and thereafter with Shah Bano and the Muslim Women's Bill. But I'll skip over some of these portions here. I'd like now to illustrate how this, some of these understandings and misunderstandings about secularism actually manifest. And in order to do that, I will give you an instance from the world of print media, which is indeed a privileged domain where these understandings are actually able to take root. We have Tavleen Singh, a national columnist with the Indian Express, visiting Gujarat after the riots, chatting with some young men at a tea shop in the village of Mogri, finding that their support for Narendra Modi, Chief Minister, was quite open. For instance, they told her that if the Congress was in power, half of them would be in jail, since Narendra Modi could not protect them. Tavleen Singh then asked if they thought that the massacres of Muslims and the rape of young girls in Ahmedabad had been a good idea. They replied, quote, with angry unanimity and conviction, close quotes, that there had been no rapes except in Godhra, where 20 women, according to the Gujarati newspapers, had been raped. That is to say, by Muslims. Tavleen Singh told them this was incorrect and that Sandesh and Gujarat Samachar had published denials. With more anger, the young men, of whom there were 30 or 40, said, it is the English newspapers that tell lies. As Singh insistently carried on a debate with them, the men launched into an attack against the English press that was so angry and so aggressive, that it seemed there could be more violence, quote unquote, and so she left. Tavleen Singh does not explore this incident further. It is worth asking why, for the young men, no defense was considered necessary when it came to Gujarati newspapers, even when they contradicted Hindu nationalist claims. Similarly, it is striking that for Tavleen Singh, the charge that English papers tell lies is worth repeating only as a portrait of a communal mindset. The accusation is itself so uninteresting that no rebuttal is required. It was these men and those like them who were under investigation, and to turn the telescope around was not required. Here we glimpse not only the mythic world of Hindu national realism, but the parallel universe of secular realism, and an event that, despite an attempt at investigative journalism, appears like a missed encounter. One way to initiate a description of it is to indicate the material bases through which secular realism is constituted. It is appropriate that the example chosen features a print journalist, because print news culture is indeed a privileged orbit of these parallel worlds. We can locate Nehruvian secularism here, at the level of sociolinguistic practice, in its adherents' ability to switch between different linguistic codes and registers, specifically between English as a language of command and Indian languages. Performative competence in elaborated codes of the English language appears as a public secret of secular realism. That secularism was identified with English language speakers was known to all, but it could not be admitted by English language users themselves, since this would obviously compromise the position from which they defended secularism, as well as secularism itself. What did it mean for secularists to uphold realism in a society where realist narrative tropes were evident mainly in their scarcity, where the achievement of realism proceeded unevenly and contradictorily in a nationalist project that worked through a public that was split by language, caste, and creed? How did realism operate across the linguistic divide when it was always seen to be anchored in the perceptual neutrality and objectivity of the English language news culture, and this news culture in its turn based its authority on a state whose neutrality was hardly a general assumption? Seen from the side of indigenous languages, it could be argued, as it has been argued, that the state was never neutral, but passed from one form of colonialism, British-led, to another, led by a technocratic English-speaking elite. This is, for example, the kind of argument the BJP has made. Sober realism was hardly adequate to capture the registers of responses to this new and perhaps unforeseen marginalization. That is, the cultural invisibility of the Indian language intelligentsia, despite its history of being at the forefront of the anti-colonial struggle and the demographic majority it stood for, vis-à-vis English language speakers in India. To conclude very briefly, I mentioned at the outset that it's important to try to understand the place of the media in the politicization that occurs here. It's worth recalling that the sequence of development that we have in a country like India vis-a-vis the West is rather different, and this can actually make its influence can be very far-reaching. The proliferation of mass communication entails the ability, as I think some of the previous papers have shown very nicely, the ability of new centers of knowledge to arise and of existing forms of authority that are actually able to adjudicate what kinds of knowledge are appropriate and what kinds are not appropriate. Those forms of authority become destabilized and really thrown up for grabs. Now, what we have in a country like, say, the United States or the United Kingdom is a sequence of development where the development of mass communication follows upon a history in which the political consolidation of the nation state has already been achieved, perhaps a century or more before the onset of these new instruments of communication. Whereas in a country like India, we find the process of democratization, of being enfolded within the national political community, and the spread of these new instruments of communication more or less happening at the very same time. As a result, the kinds of crises of knowledge that in the West were able to be adjudicated by professionals, by experts of one kind or another, and mediated in some fashion, immediately reverberate through the personal and the political levels and are always going to be providing fodder for various kinds of political battles. And I suggest what we have here is one example of that kind of mobilization. Thank you.
Thank you, Arvind. Please join me in a round of applause for the speakers. I'd like to open up to questions now. Please introduce yourself and keep your questions brief. Thank you. Bill?
You've just introduced me. Bill Milam from the Woodrow Wilson Center. And this question is for Professor Luden, and it's about Bangladesh. And you told us a bit about the conflict that has characterized their politics for the last really 2 decades. I'm not sure I caught everything you were saying about the sources of that conflict, but here's the question, and it has to do with a group here which has been exploring different cases of pre-conflict intervention. And they've looked at places like Estonia, where it has been quite successful, and places where it hasn't been so successful. And one of the countries that is coming up but hasn't been discussed in any detail is Bangladesh. Given the sources of that conflict there, what would be your recommendation as to, one, whether there is a realistic possibility that either inside or outside parties could somehow arrange for this conflict to be alleviated, or and how would that be done?
Well, let me say, the current situation in Bangladesh is that the electoral process has been put on hold. Initially, through a constitutional procedure for the formation of an interim government, which called a caretaker government, which was to arrange for the elections in February. But when it was determined that the current arrangements for the conduct of elections weren't really going to be acceptable to the wide range of political parties in Bangladesh, but also also importantly to the international donor community. A new government emerged really on the eve of the scheduled elections, and that government is described in the newspapers typically as military-backed, military-supported. Clearly has the support of the military. And it is now involved in a process of purging the political system of corruption according to its own self-representations. It's arrested a lot of people. It's engaged in a process of throwing people suspected of corruption across the board into jail, and in general doing a number of things to prevent the reemergence of political forces in the country that were based upon illegal forms of raising money and illegal forms of using violence for electoral purposes. That's the current situation. Now, this is...
I wanted to ask, my question was trying to get at the cultural forces that are below, that are creating what the army is now trying to help with.
Well, I was just going to say that when you suggested the possibility that some forces might become involved in trying to solve the conflict, and that these might be international as well, I was just going to end by saying it is not currently recognized or admitted, but it's becoming very obvious, I think, to many observers that some consortium of international interested parties from outside Bangladesh are involved in guiding this and supporting this government. And it's very likely, given the tenor of politics in Bangladesh, that major donors, including the international agencies and particular donor countries, United States, Australia, Japan, Norwegian, Scandinavian countries, and so on, are involved in attempting to use this government to provide a more conflict-free, a lower degree of conflict and a lower degree of corruption in the political system of Bangladesh. So I think what you've suggested might be possible, has already happened. But not publicly. We don't know.
Any questions? Dennis Cooks?
I'm one. Dennis Cooks here at the Wilson Center also. I'm wondering why, Professor Roger Pollan, why hasn't Gujarat spread? I mean, there are other parts of India that have supported the BJP. There are other places in India where you've had violence, but not this sort.
Right. Well, the BJP was in power both in the center and at the state level at the time, and I think it confirms the suspicion that the violence was being politically managed and that its outbreak was being regulated with a view to its political outcomes rather than in purely spontaneous fashion as was being explained at the time.
Hello, My name is Yasmin Peer. I just finishing up my master's degree at American and International Peace and Conflict Resolution, and I spent 5 months in Gujarat studying communal violence in 2005, so it was like 3 years after the violence. I guess what you just said right now kind of is a nice little segue to my question, and I guess spending so much time there and interviewing like over 60 victim survivors of I call it a genocide, really. Many people term it as a pogrom, but a pogrom could be, a smaller version of a genocide. I was just a little bit confused as to your view on whether the violence was pre-planned or not, because and the way that you talked about the Godra incident as well, while there was like a skirmish leading up to the violence, leading up to the train burning, there was a lot of forensic research that was done preceding that sort of proved that there was no way the fire could have been lit from the outside, but rather from the inside, and it was probably an accident and not really like a mob, the way that the media had portrayed it. And so that's one thing. So I was just unsure as to what you think. And I guess from the gentleman's question that preceded, it seems like you're saying that the outbreak was, I guess, sort of politically managed. But I think the whole thing was planned, really. I mean, I think there's this Professor Paul Brass from the University of Washington. I don't know. You're probably familiar with the riot production thesis. I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Yes, the Banerjee Committee report did indicate that the train was unlikely to have been set on fire by Muslims, and that was something more, perhaps some spontaneous combustion due to the large number of people packed in. It was winter, the windows were closed, etc., and the spark could have, set it on fire. And the tubing at the end of the compartment was set on fire by the people agitating and so forth. But the larger question, I appreciate the importance of it, and I think this is obviously an important matter for ongoing inquiry. Very difficult to conduct in the Indian context because state agencies are involved at every level, and although the BJP has been displaced, there's extraordinary level of intimidation of witnesses and so forth. I'd like, however, to step aside from that a bit to point to the fact that there was what is indubitable is that there was a great deal of violence with a great deal of public support, and that's really what I've been trying to focus on. Who lit the spark? Who fired the shots? I mean, those are additional questions. But the fact of massive popular support, engineered, whipped up and so forth politically, is indubitable. The fact of violence being enfolded into the electoral process and, apparently enduring, is demonstrable here. And that, I think, is the most important, offers the most important set of questions to address for my purposes.
It is worth noting that in the period immediately before this, there were serious doubts about the electoral possibilities of Narendra Modi, and there were defeats of the BJP in other states that made it look like it was the BJP's last stand, so to speak. There was a lot of attention put on that election in Gujarat, and so that's one thing. The other thing is one has to remember that that Gujarat is, in a sense, the bastion of the BJP in India. The answer to the question of why didn't it spread is there is no other Gujarat in India. It's absolutely mistaken to imagine that India is full of potential Gujarats. It's not. It's a very special place where a very special articulation of not just BJP but the whole Sangh Parivar with everyday politics and with the violence of displaced, the victims of globalization are also very hard pressed in Gujarat. So it's a very, very peculiar and potentially violent combination of things that really isn't replicated in other parts of India.
But I would like to ask our other panelists, Eng Seng and Faisal as well, if they'd like to contribute to this, I think, rather important discussion about violence and the fruitfulness of a causal approach to understanding violence as opposed to something that is either more phenomenological or that tries to deal with its facticity, which I think both of you have done in your own papers in different ways.
I think I was quite struck by the statement someone made about the lack of spread of essentially Hindu-Muslim violence to the rest of India, when so much of what we see and read in Indian politics is about, or has been about, Hindu-Muslim divisions and violence. And so I think I take David Ludden's point that there is a special configuration of factors in Gujarat. And I guess David's point rests on perhaps a socio-economic analysis of a high injection of capital, probably a diasporic Gujarati capital in the past 10 years or so, working with what is essentially, I guess, the lowest paid workers in daily terms, 200 rupees, something like that, in India, in Gujarat. So I think you mean that, right? That it's a especially explosive situation which is not replicated as elsewhere. But in terms which are not socioeconomic, I think that the way in which the politics of majoritarianism in India, in that sense, I think Gujarat shares a lot with the rest of India. And I think Arvind said something about how transformations of secular, non-secular categories have taken place in India. I think that there still is a lot of way to go in terms of how the politics of majoritarianism plays out in India, across India.
Yes. I think one of the interesting things about Gujarat is the fact that it seems to me only now with things like this, with incidents like these extended moments of violence, it's only these sorts of instances that actually allow Gujarat to finally, perhaps even for the first time, become part of the body politic of India in a very particular way. For the longest time, Gujarat meant, and even for Gandhi, its most famous son, it was not clear how Gujarat was related to the rest of India territorially, precisely because of this enormous diasporic population that it had and continues to have, and that continues to be very, very important to it in the way of the transmission of funds, the support of certain kinds of political parties, etc., etc. I think to take a kind of long-term look at this, one could see the even though the name has existed for a long while, Gujarat, came into existence as Gujarat only well after independence. Right? It was part of Bombay Presidency. Before that, it was not. It was ruled out of Bombay, the city of Bombay, and for a long while there was a great deal of trouble because Bombay was disputed between Gujarat and Maharashtra as the capital of. It was eventually given over to Maharashtra. And so for the longest time, Gujarat actually survived without a real capital. Its capital now, Gandhinagar, is an absurd little place. I mean, it's not really. It was not its chief city, Ahmedabad. So it had this really vestigial, strange existence, even though it was economically prosperous. It was tied to the other ends of the world in so many ways. And you see this with someone like Gandhi himself. When Gandhi doesn't get a job in India, when he comes back from England, he goes to South Africa. He doesn't go to Delhi. He doesn't go to any other place, right? That Gujarat was for him, because there were a bunch of Gujaratis in South Africa who happened to be Muslim who invited him. Gujarat's connections were far more outside India in certain ways than they were within. I think one of the things that's happening here, even though this is not a causal factor in any sense, is the kind of the embrace of Mother India, in a sense. Gujarat is enjoying its moment of nationalization, but that has nothing to say about, that simply, I think, provides the larger context for these things. The other curious things that are happening in these riots that make them differ from some others is that you see the huge involvement of middle and to some extent even upper middle class people in the riots themselves. They're not simply commanding them from their penthouse apartments. They're actually out there looting shops and in some cases killing people. That's very, very unusual. And also that might also, and also the attack for the first time on Muslim communities had never been attacked before. Right? I belong to one of those. We had never been attacked before in Gujarat, but we were for the first time. Right? It was inconceivable, and my community actually has a very significant philanthropic presence in the state. Right? So we sponsor all kinds of schools, hospitals, things like that. These very villages in which these institutions were sponsored, the residents of the villages turned against people in mine and other communities. Right? In other words, at that point, the whole explanation of was there an economic, a crude economic factor involved breaks down. It's not like those schools, hospitals, wells, etc. were going to be replaced by the government of Gujarat. Those moments of violence were in that sense sacrificial, right? And so I don't think the economic thing is very, very important, but in that very fundamental instance, it breaks down. Just those thoughts.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Comments, questions? Okay. Dennis?
Listening to you about this, in effect you're saying that the authority, that political authority broke down in Gujarat, or it favored the troubles. And what came to mind as you were talking about this is 1984 in Delhi and the Sikh community. And I'm wondering if I never really thought about the two as a parallel. I'm wondering if that's a reasonable parallel.
Yeah, I think there's many aspects that are parallel. I think there was, it wasn't that there was a breakdown of authority, it was a delegation of authority, very conscious and, coordinated in various ways. I think the difference perhaps is that in the case of the Indira Gandhi assassination and the killings that followed of Sikhs thereafter, I would say that in many ways set the stage for the kind of Hindu nationalist mobilization that happened thereafter. It took many of its cues from the language and symbols and practice of Sikhs and the forms of community mobilization, much of the rhetoric that they rehearsed, which was against the Hindus, regarding themselves as separate, non-Hindu, etc. Many one finds many parallels taken over and turned a little bit, of course, because it was now the Hindus that were doing it. So that's an important parallel in more ways than you might imagine. But yes, I think the fact that this was restricted to one state as opposed to the 1984 case where one had really, it was not just Delhi, there were, Sikhs were attacked in various parts of the country, suggested that it had a more, one could argue that there was a more spontaneous aspect to it. In Gujarat, it was so rigidly controlled and so forth. But, yeah.
I just have two things to say about any kind of Gujarat spreading. I think if people want to pay a little bit of attention to Rajasthan, because the BJP took over power there, and there's a lot of interesting things going on with what kind of happened in Gujarat with changing the laws that have to do with conversion, and a lot of other similar things that happened in Gujarat early on are happening in Rajasthan now. So I would say definitely that's an area to pay attention to. Just having the BJP in power there and the changes that are going on. It's a little bit scary. There was violence, actually, when I was there in 2005 in Rajasthan against the Muslim community. So I think that's just one place to pay attention to. And then the other thing I wanted to say was the reason I understand that it's important to pay attention to other things other than who started it or what exactly or what. But the reason why is because a lot of the people that committed the violence are still in power, and I found that as a constant impediment to justice. And I agree with what you say. I found that really important. You said that the violence committed by Hindus often did not register as violence to other Hindus, and you used 2 examples, and I really appreciate that. It's exactly what I found was that in a society, you can't move to reconciliation. You can't have anyone feeling justice if there's no acknowledgement on the part of the perpetrator. I think that's a huge problem with the court cases going on in Gujarat, and so many of them having to be moved to Mumbai and other things. And I think that's the reason why, in my field, I look at it's international peace and conflict resolution. So we try to look at ways to resolve things, and I think that's why I immediately was curious as to what you thought, because I feel like in order to get to another place and have those people have justice, there needs to be some sort of reparation, there needs to be acknowledgement, and someone needs to be held accountable. So I'm not sure if in your studies you have any suggestions or thoughts of like where to look to sort of remedy that.
I would just say this, that the sense of an irremediably corrupt judicial process where every move by the courts to appoint a commission, to re-examine the burning of the train in Godhra, each one of these steps, however impeccable its reasoning appears to be, is immediately received as a political, a swing in the balance of power, as another sort of counter in, a complicated chess game, and really unable to be extricated from the politics which the courts are supposed to stand above. So while, one should proceed with the fact-finding and so forth, as I say, the indisputable facts seem to be that the violence occurred and that there was popular support for it, and, hence my focus of inquiry, though I appreciate yours.
Do the other panelists have any comments to make, especially on the issue of peace and conflict resolution?
I think the problem the current government in New Delhi has no interest in breaking this thing open because it would be seen as a totally partisan act that would generate more opposition. And I think that this government in Delhi is run by fantastically brilliant people who are trying desperately to put the BJP out of business and neglect and training the world to see India as the world's freest, most brilliant, wonderful capitalist land of milk and honey is the way to do that, and raising up this specter of India as a land of monstrous, communal, bigoted, killers is just not in the interest of the government. They do not want to have that be India's public. They are totally into India's global public image right now. So peace and reconciliation, the route to it in Gujarat, in the India that we live in today, is through a capitalist bonanza, and that's something that the BJP and Narendra Modi and the current government in Delhi have in common. They both want that, and that's what they're going for. And so this will be buried, or it will go away.
Well, we had
That's
the
my-
Sankar report.
Well, let's
Yeah.
Sacha Commission.
And that had a little bit to do with the reparations. or some of
Ripples will be there. There will be
Yeah.
things, but I think that peace and reconciliation in this case have different ways to get there. And I'm just saying that strategically speaking, I don't think the government of India is going to have a lot of enthusiasm for a South Africa type of situation.
I think I'll venture something. Just to connect the discussion here with the Wilson Center, I think I would say that what we've been discussing in terms of Gujarat and India, communal violence, is part of a larger landscape of what you might call communalism, cultural conflict, and so on, which is part of, I would say, a longer history, meaning to say that when President Wilson called for self-determination of peoples and nations, it was thought that after the Second World War, when many nations were given independence, that indeed this was a fulfilling of his vision. And so we have things called nation states sitting at the United Nations. But as it turns out, what was given independence were not nations, but colonies, former colonies. So this was what was the basis for our nation states today. Decolonization, colonies became independent, not nations. And these colonies continue to be infested with the kinds of inter-ethnic conflicts which had been endemic in the colonial period. What was different now was that they were thought to be independent on the basis of self-sovereignty, and in the Wilsonian sense, self-sovereignty of nations or cultural groups. When you mix this with a numerical electoral basis for the determination of representation, I think what you get is essentially a cocktail for violence, and we continue to see it today, ratcheted up beyond what existed when you did have a colonial Leviathan sitting on top of all of them.
There is another question? Yes, gentleman at the back.
Professor, that's always been true. It's not necessarily the case that giving self-determination to former colonies has in and of itself sparked an unusual amount of violence. The emergence of nation states has always sparked violence. The boundaries of Germany were drawn after Westphalia around 17 different ethnic groups. You had 500 years of civil war in Europe as a result of this. Yeah. So it's not necessarily the result of colonialism that there's violence. There's no question that it's a contributing factor, but it certainly isn't a sole factor, is it? And let me just say, just return to the Middle East, that I keep hearing people talk about the emergence of a Muslim identity in the Middle East that we in the West have to recognize. But while I was in the Middle East, I saw an American Idol-like program that is focused on young people competing like American Idol to get record contracts. And what I saw in the audience was the Iraqi flag, the Egyptian flag, the Algerian flag. I didn't see the emergence of a Muslim identity. I saw the emergence of nation states.
I think it's quite apt that you bring in the comparison with the wars in Germany leading up to Westphalia. The comparison with the United Nations is quite direct, I think, because both Westphalia and the UN system were formed after, you could say, 30 years of incessant warfare, or 30 years of dramatic warfare. And the way in which it was thought to be settled in both cases was similar, in the sense that in Westphalia, it was said that the religion of the people is the religion of the prince. So in that sense, that to me institutes majoritarianism. Okay, in this case, in the Westphalian case, not majoritarianism, but the prince, the religion of the country is the religion of the prince, and therefore, if you are a Protestant power outside, you cannot intervene on the basis of defending Protestants within another prince's territory, right? So there is this notion that what came out of the Westphalian settlement after 30 years of great warfare was a homogeneous state. Homogeneous nominally, but homogeneous juridically under a prince. I think something similar was established theoretically after when the UN system was formed, which was that it was thought that each nation was now homogeneous, not under a prince, but because this was the nature of the people.